with everyone. All right, and it's 9:01. So welcome everybody. Eli Sagor here, Extension Specialist with the Sustainable Forest Education Co-op and the Cloquet Forestry Center. Really happy to have everyone here. You can see from this title slide that this is going to be a little bit of an unconventional talk, and I think a really good one. Our guest is Steve Windels. Steve is with the National Park Service up at Voyageurs National Park. And it's just a pleasure to have him. He's a fun presenter, and I think this is going to be a good one. A couple of quick things before we begin. This is the second to last webinar in our 2022 series. The topic today, as you can see, is the good, the bad, and the furry. Steve is going to be talking about cattails and muskrats. And we are going to close out our annual series in a little more than a month. The last presentation in the series is December 20th. We're going to hear from Mary Hammis talking about the Minnesota Million. You've probably heard about the Minnesota Million. Her subtitle is An Ambitious Vision for Reforesting 1 Million Acres in Minnesota. Mary's with the Nature Conservancy. And we're going to be talking a little bit about that vision and how it might be put into practice. What does it mean for land managers? Where are the seedlings going to come from? Any number of questions associated with that. And as always, that talk is really going to focus on practical applications and what people need to know. So I encourage you to check in on that one too. Again, questions, submit them via chat at any time. I think we're going to wrap up before 10 o'clock. I personally need to cut out a few minutes before 10. So you'll hear from Lane managing questions, and he might close this out if need be. I think with that, I'm going to hand the screen to Steve Windels. Steve, you're on.
Okay, thanks, Eli. Again, I appreciate you inviting me. The good that I'm talking about is healthy wetlands. The bad is cattails, of course, invasive cattails particularly, and the furry is muskrats with or without 6-gun shooters. So by the way, one of the downsides of doing presentations by Zoom is that I can't hear anybody's laughter. And so when I tell a joke, I'm going to play this sound just so I don't feel alone out there. Okay. Oops. So let's see, I gotta minimize that part. Okay. This wetland restoration project, Bryce Olson and I started this in 2016. Bryce has since moved on, and Reed Blum took over for a couple of years. He has now moved on. He's with the Forest Service, Chippewa National Forest. And now Jerry Warmbold is my current project manager on this project. And again, also starring all of the technicians and volunteers and interns who work on this on a day-to-day basis. So again, maybe a lot of foresters out there, just pretend cattails are just tiny trees, just tiny skinny trees. Okay, maybe this will all make sense to you. But this is a monoculture of invasive cattail. This is about 15 acres of just solid cattail. And again, some folks still are confused about why cattail is or isn't bad. Again, this is the bad part of the movie. So native broadleaf cattail, Typha latifolia, is the native species in most of North America or Eastern North America. A non-native narrowleaf cattail invaded about 200 years ago on the East Coast, and they hybridized, and now this invasive hybrid, Typha biglauca, excuse me, has taken over, and this is the dominant phenotype here in most of the eastern U.S. And we actually some work that was done here in Voyageurs National Park and a few other national parks back in 2000. This came out 2010 with some of the seminal work, really trying to describe the genetic makeup of these hybrid swarms. And again, this is a problem that primarily in the upper Midwest and the Great Lakes, where you have this hybrid zone between the latifolia and the angustifolia. So what happens is cattail, you can kind of see in the middle here. This is normally cattail grows in shallowish water or wet soils. But what happens once this hybrid came along, it's a thing called hybrid vigor, where now it can grow in much deeper water, can grow in greater varieties of alkalinity and salinity, nutrients, all kinds of things. So it just fills in this greater growing space and now starts to outcompete all of these other native plants, both in the submergent and emergent zones. And again, one of the things, so here you can see this monoculture of cattail on the back, and the wild rice, again, is prevented from growing there just like anything else is. So again, it just outcompetes all of the native plants, and it sets off a whole cascade of things from there. One of the other problems is that it can create these floating mats, which can break off and cause some problems, and I'll talk about that. Some work we've done with that later on as well. So here in Voyageurs National Park in northern Minnesota, right on the border with Ontario, almost all of the wetlands that we have, the lacustrine wetlands anyway, have been invaded by cattails to some degree. And on the west and side of the park is more as you go east, sorry, this is more the classic Canadian Shield, where it's much rockier shorelines. And as you go west, again, we get shallower wetlands and more clay soils. And again, this is where we tend to see the cattails really dominating. So one of the things, all of the border waters between Minnesota and Ontario are protected by state statutes called Outstanding Resource Value Waters, and herbicides are not permitted to be used in the aquatic environment. So this is one of the main tools that's used to treat cattail and prairie pottle regions, for example, and we just don't have that tool here. Another issue that we have here is water levels are managed at several dams here that were created for water level management, also hydropower. And so this artificial manipulation of the water level has probably exacerbated the problem of cattail spreading vegetatively, but probably also by seed. And one of the other things that that we learned when we started poking around on this is there's no cookbook for this. This is especially in the southern boreal forest region and in lakes, is just there's no cookbook and nobody's really done this stuff. So we were, trying to figure this out as we went along, and pioneers to some extent. So again, in 2016, we started the Voyageurs Wetland Restoration Project to start to restore these degraded wetlands in the park and in some of the adjacent areas. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the different treatments that we've been trying. Again, some have worked better than others. So here, this is on those floating sections of cattail, we use a technique with these. This is called a swamp devil or a cookie cutter. It's basically a floating barge with two big rotating heads on the front that just comes in and chops this stuff up. And I have some video to show you that. But again, it only works in these floating sections. Once you get into the rooted sections, there's not enough water to float this barge. And that's where we use another technique called underwater cutting. So you can do this with a sickle bar cutter mounted on a amphibious machine like we have on the lower left. We also can use underwater brush saws. Both of these techniques work pretty well. Again, so here's the machines. The blue machine on the left is called the harvesting barge, and it's like an aquatic combine essentially. And the one on the right is that swamp devil. So let's try the video. Okay, this is working lovely. So this is some drone footage that the owners of this business, Lakes Aquatic Weed Removal, based out of Orr, Minnesota, took for us a couple years ago, just outside of the park. So that machine in the middle, the smaller one, the swamp devil, again, he's going up to the cattails and he just moves the front of that boat back and forth, that cutter head, and just chops this stuff into tiny little pieces. And it sprays mud and cattails all over, and occasionally sticks and logs and all kinds of stuff comes shooting out of there. And then that harvesting barge paddles around and scoops up all of the floating stuff and then deposits it on shore. And that's one of the challenges we've encountered, is all of the biomass that we create by chopping this stuff. Now we have to do something with it. So I'm going to go to the next. So one of the other things we figured out, so we thought, based on some previous experience of other folks, that if we just dump this biomass, these piles on shore, they would compost quickly and they'd be gone. Well, it turns out they compost down much slower than we thought. And so what we ended up doing is taking these piles and using them to our advantage, essentially creating mulch to go ahead and smother invasive cattail in the areas in that emergent wet meadow zone where cattail is starting to encroach. This is a very labor-intensive thing, and it's super hard on our amphibious machine, unfortunately. We've spent a lot of time fixing this thing as a result, but once we get it smoothed out, again, it looks like this. Again, it's been pretty effective. There's a little video here of our little tiller head on the back that we used again to get this smoothed out and flat. By the way, this machine is called a MobiTrack. It's made in Denmark, and it's a piece of junk. And please don't buy one because you'll regret it. Okay, one of the other things we do is surface cuts. So this is again where this is all cattail that's basically above the water line, and we have just tried to do some cutting with the sickle bar cutter in these areas to see what kind of reduction in cattail cover that we get. One of the other things that we're trying to do is burning. And you would think burning in wetlands would be simple, but the windows for prescription are pretty narrow, and we have to do this when there's snow in the woods, but there's still enough ice to get out onto the lake to access these. So it's been a challenge in terms of getting access to burning these things. But so why do we burn? I think a lot of folks, when we tell them we're burning, they just their first reaction is, well, that's not going to kill the cattails, and we know that that's true. It doesn't actually kill the cattails, but one of the things it does is it removes that leaf litter, which again is part of this feedback loop where when you have cattails start to invade, the litter drops down and it again smothers out the other vegetation except for other cattails which can grow on it. So we interrupt that feedback loop. We also reduce the amount of spoil piles, and these things again from some focus studies that we did, we estimated how much biomass is being generated for each in each meter squared or each acre of what we treat, and it's a lot of biomass that's generated. So if we can burn some of this off, it makes the whole process more cost efficient. And again, it's fun burning cattails when you can actually get out there and you get the prescriptions, right? Good time. All right, so what are some of our outcomes to date on the work that we've been doing? And again, we do vegetation monitoring, have been doing it annually in all of our plots. So we have pre-treatment data, and then we've been doing it every year. Afterwards, we're going to start going to a more staggered schedule now, where we'll be only monitoring every 2 to 5 years post-treatment. It varies based on the treatment types and where we're at, but it'll be a little bit more intermittent long-term monitoring for the vegetation component anyway. So not surprisingly, so this first treatment on the left, this is a graph showing the total removal. So that's with the cookie cutter machine. So when you go in and you take these floating mats and you chop them into tiny bits and then dump them on shore in big piles, it's super effective. Again, 90% reduction in typha cover. So, and this is one of the treatments that we think will have the longest lasting effect. These mats take a long time to form, and once we chop them up, it's going to take, who knows, 20, 30 years, maybe longer before they may, if left untreated, before they were able to reach that original extent. It's also the most expensive treatment method that we have. So coming in at anywhere from $5,000 to $10,000 an acre to do this with the heavy contracted machines. The other one is this smother treatment. So again, that's where we took the compost or all of the vegetation that we collect from the water and then dump it on the shoreline and then spread it out. This smothering treatment that we call it, again, has also been very effective in terms of reducing cattail cover up to 2 years post-treatment. And the last one, the underwater cutting in those areas, again, that are too shallow for the cookie cutter machine, or for whatever reason we don't want to use that big machine. This underwater cutting, again, is really very effective. And in a lot of sense, this is probably our most cost-effective method for treating cattails and reducing that biomass or the cover and biomass of cattail and giving growing space for all of these other native plants to come in. What we're calling the non-lethal treatments again. So this isn't actually killing the roots of the cattail, but it is reducing the amount of cover, and even the surface cutting again, up to 3 years post-treatment is pretty good at reducing cover, and the same with the burns. So in addition to measuring cover of cattail, we also measure cover of some other different classes of emergent plants. So rushes, sedges, grasses, some other herbaceous plants, and then the amount of open water, and then the amount of bare ground. So basically for all of our different treatment types, we've seen a positive response in these other components of the plant community, which is great. Either a positive response or no response. So again, we have yet to record any sort of negative response for any of these, which is again really good news, and we think that that's positive. So one of the main focuses of our work is restoring wild rice, which obviously has a significant cultural component here for in Minnesota. And so here in Voyageurs National Park, all these dams went in around the early 1900s, and it raised the water levels by about 1 meter in Rainy Lake and all of the lakes in the Namakan Reservoir. And when that happened, it flooded out a lot of the historic wild rice beds that were there. But there's still some remnant rice stands out there. And we have found that when we target those areas where historically there were rice beds, but now it's cattail, once we get rid of that cattail, that seed bed is still viable, which is amazing. So some cases, it could have been covered by cattail for 30, 40 years. And once we remove that cattail and with no seeding, the wild rice just comes back on its own, which has been amazing to see. So here's, this is kind of one of our poster children's, Rooter Creek on Rainy Lake. So this is the before photo, and then these polygons, this is where we did the total removal. In 1 year post-treatment, again, we saw this huge increase in the cover of wild rice, a 5-fold increase in this one wetland in particular. Other areas, it's been a little bit more intermittent. And again, we think it's those areas that historically would have had rice beds tend to do better than those areas where we didn't have evidence of that there were rice beds. So again, here's this Rooter Creek. So in 2020, before we did all the total removal, you can see the floating cattail on the left. And then if you go to that right panel, this is what it looked like a year later. Again, it's just solid rice everywhere. And here's another, this is the same site, Rooter Creek, before and after, again, just stepping you through that process with that upper left panel, again, going in with the cookie cutter machine. Then there's the spoil piles, and then smoothing out the spoil piles, and then what it looked like after that second fall of 2021. Here's an aerial view showing the same thing. And this is another site that we did. This is the very first one we did at a 15-acre wetland by the Rainy Lake Visitor Center. That photo I showed at the very beginning of that monoculture of cattail, that was from this spot. So again, going in with the heavy machines and digging out that big mat, again, we've created a lot more heterogeneity in this complex. We've created some flow now to come through around this island. This traditionally would have been an island, but now had been cut off because of all the cattails. And again, just seeing a lot more diversity of other vegetation growing in these areas that were treated and where the cattail had been removed. So that was the cattails is the bad part. The good part, right? This is the healthy wetland. This is what we want a diverse, healthy wetland should look like, right? And so you have this mixture of emergence and submergence, and with just a little cattail on the margins. That's really what it should be looking like. So how do you solve a problem like floating cattail mats? Don't ask Maria. So how do these mats form and detach? Again, this is where Ignore that red dot. That's from a previous presentation where I was recording this. So it's going to buzz around here like a space saucer for a little bit. So, but these mats start to form, and basically as the cattails grow and the mats form, that rhizomatous mat basically starts to float, and then the whole mat floats, and then eventually it'll break off and disperse and facilitate new invasions. So why is that a problem? Again, these big mats bounce around and they create navigation hazards. That's certainly one of the biggest reasons why people know about these. They damage infrastructure, smashing into people's docks and things like that. Obviously, they create new points of infestation. Anytime where this floating cattail mat now finally ends up and lands in a spot, it's just gonna basically reduce the quality of that whatever littoral area where it landed. So one of the things that we were able to do is by studying aerial photos over time, we started to notice that you could see individual mats and we could track them over the years. So here's a case, again, my helpful little red dot from 2013. These three little chunks here, when there was some channels dug in between them. There was the high water event in 2014. Those three chunks broke off and floated away, and then again we could watch see where they ended up on the east end of Black Bay. So we did this for all the photos that we could find between 1992 and 2019, and delineated all of the floating mats that we could see out there. This one down in the bottom was a big one that was bouncing around Lake Cabotogama in 2017, I believe. This was about 2 hectares in size, big. So delineated over 670 individual mats, and the mean size was almost, again, 1,000 meters squared. Some of them, again, the biggest was 2,500 meters squares, or 2.5 hectares. So each photo year that we looked at, we could see again new mats appearing that we hadn't seen in previous photos. So this is a phenomenon that's happening all the time. It's sort of like birthing of glaciers calving, right? It's the same sort of thing. About 17 new mats per year that we would see within the whole study area. And then we're also able to detect each year by, again, tracking individual mats. So 70 different mats moved from year to year. So that doesn't mean that's not 70 new mats. That's just those mats that we had identified. We could see from one year to the next that they had moved. So again, these things are ping-ponging around the lake all the time. Total distance traveled, the mean was fairly short, 1 kilometer, but again, some of these went as far as 15 kilometers. And the mean azimuth traveled was southeast, which again, the prevailing winds are out of the northwest here, so that made sense that they would mostly end up going southeast from their original spot. It's a bit of a complicated graph, but we looked at, again, how do flood and drought events relate to when these mats are created, and not surprising, more mats are created after flood events, and there's a lag effect, so it's not even the year of the flood, but the years afterwards, because again, the flood seems to weaken these mats and they break apart and then bounce around. And likewise, in years after droughts are where we saw fewer mat movements. So dispersal largely by prevailing winds. There are some places with current where, again, that helps move stuff around as well. And what we noticed is these mats start at a certain size, and then they start, as they bounce around, ping pong around, they break apart and split up, and now you have more smaller mats moving around. These mats tend to develop in wind and wave protected areas with enough water. It's got to be deep enough where the floating mats can actually grow. So this is where we focused our management, is on these areas, again, where we feel like mats are most likely to develop, and then we can sort of nip it in the bud and remove the mats before they break off and float somewhere else. In terms of water level management, the more interannual variability you can get in the water levels should reduce the chance of these floating mats forming. But that's not always possible. Lakes are not all managed equally. So what to do with the mats? Again, what we sometimes do when these things break apart and we find out, we get angry phone calls or text messages. that there's a map bounce around. We could put it back in the original location, or if that's not feasible, we put it into a wind and wave protected bay and stake it down. But it's challenging. Moving these maps sometimes needs a lot of boats to move things and going very slowly. We've been pretty good at removing these things with the specialized equipment, the cookie cutter and the harvesting machine. But again, it's very expensive. Like I said, about $10,000 an acre, and of course it's messy, and the spoil piles create other challenges. So maybe the most cost-effective thing is to prevent the floating mats from forming in the first place. That's an open question. So the conclusions. This is from sort of the first part of this talk, which is about the Voyager's wetland map restoration project and some of the lessons that we learned. Our methods do work. Again, this is 7 years into this, 6 years into this. In 2016, I wasn't sure what kind of success we were going to have, but I've been really pleased. We've been pleased with how we've figured out what works and what doesn't, and we're getting much more efficient as time goes on. We are really trying to now prioritize our treatments on areas where we think that there's remnant wild rice stands to sort of get more bang for our buck. We also acknowledge that cattail is an important wetland component, so we're not, even if we could, we're not trying to get rid of all cattail, but again, it should be part of a much more diverse and heterogeneous wetland complex. The last little thing here is these floating mats are a real challenge. We learned that nobody wants to take management or responsibility from them. As soon as you push one of these mats into an adjacent jurisdiction, sometimes people will push them into Canada and pretend they don't exist. Or some people now like to push them into the park and let us take care of it. But again, at $10,000 an acre, nobody's handing us a check to take care of it. So, and I suspect this is anywhere else you have these floating mats, which I know happens in central Minnesota, that this is a similar issue. Like whose problem is it? All right, so let's get to, we talked about the good, which is healthy wetlands, the bad, which is invasive cattails, and the furry, which is muskrats wearing top hats and or bow ties. So herbicide treatments, again, can be very effective at killing cattails. Like I said, in the prairie pothole region, and even here in northwestern Minnesota, they do this a lot. It works quite well. Mechanical removal, as I described, also very effective, but super expensive. So what if I told you there was another way to treat cattails? Thank you. Muskrats are semi-aquatic rodents native to North America. This shouldn't be any surprise to any of you. And they have a demonstrated ability to control aquatic vegetation. Obviously, they eat cattails and bulrush and other sedges and other aquatics. So they also use cattails for building materials for their huts. So this is photo on the right is from a marsh in southern Minnesota, again, where you can see muskrat densities at high levels, and you can definitely once you reach sort of these densities, muskrats can be quite effective at clearing out cattails, again, both by eating, but maybe more so even by using them as building materials. So we got some funding from LCCMR in 2018 this is goal number 2 here, evaluate the effectiveness of muskrats as a natural control of hybrid cattails in wetlands. So one of the things we wanted to do is, what if we took muskrats and tried to find ways to facilitate them eating cattails? And then what would the outcome be? So part 1 of this is, do muskrats eat hybrid cattail? So we all thought that was the case. Certainly anecdotally, people thought it was the case, but we wanted to actually test this in an experimental way as to what do they really think about hybrid cattail? So again, this is a preferred wetland environment for muskrats, lots of spatial heterogeneity, open water, and emergent vegetation that they can use as cover, lots of different plant types and species there. This is what good muskrat habitat should look like. This is not, again, muskrats can exist around the margins, but they're not spending any time in the interior of this, because even though there's potentially abundant food, they need those other components of the ecosystem and a more diverse diet, perhaps. So one of the things that we've speculated is muskrats have been declining across most of the U.S. and the eastern U.S. in particular. And is that coincident with this increase in hybrid cattail? And what does that mean? Is part of that component that muskrats just don't really like to eat hybrid cattail as much as the native stuff. So what we did is when we were trapping muskrats for the translocation project, which I'll talk about after this, we took these muskrats and we put them into some feeding trials. So the first trial we did, we had 6 different species of plants that we presented with muskrats and in a cafeteria style. So hybrid cattail, the native cattail type of latifolia, which was challenging to find, but we had some source populations that we confirmed with genetic techniques. We also looked at these other 4 species, which are the more preferred species in muskrat diet here. So arrowhead, bulrush, sweet flag, and wild rice. And then we did a separate feeding trial where we only gave them the 2 species of cattail. So we just wanted to say, if forced to choose between these two species of cattail, the native cattail and the hybrid, what do their feeding behaviors and preferences look like? We built these boxes, these 6x6 plywood enclosures with a lid on top. Have this, again, the 6 pans there with the 6 different foods or 2 different foods. In each pan, we weighed out how much food we gave them before we put the rats in the box for 2 hours, and then weighed it afterwards. So we could look at, again, how much biomass of food they actually were eating. There's water in the center that we provided them so they could drink as needed. So here's 2 short little video clips just showing you what the muskrats were doing while they were in these boxes. So here, again, this is just the 2 different types of cattail. So in this case, the muskrat, he's down here at the bottom, poking around in that one. He had already eaten some. You can see it outside of the bowl there. And then now he's going up to this other side, and he's going to pull one out of there and start husking it like shucking it like corn almost, so you can get to that chewy inside. We had GoPro cameras mounted on all these so we could record, again, things like their behavior and how much time they spent at each of the 6 trays and that sort of thing. Okay, so briefly, I'm just going to walk you through these results. So here, this is from the feeding trial 1, where we provide them with the 6 different types of food. So in this case, muskrat spent the most time feeding on bulrush and wild rice. Arrowhead was 3rd, and then the 2 cattails were towards the bottom. Here's dry matter consumed. So this is how much actual biomass did they consume once we dried them out and removed the wet weight. Again, bulrush and wild rice now appear towards the top. Arrowhead and the cattails and sweet flag in a 2nd tier. And then now this is dry matter intake rate. So this is not to get too much in the weeds on this, but pun intended, I'm not sure. But this just says the rate at which they're eating the cattails, and it's corrected for body weight and the amount of time they spent feeding. So again, the native species were generally higher in this, in hybrid cattail, and the native cattail and with the other species in a lower tier. So in general, all of these point to that when presented with a variety of a more varied diet, some of these other species they prefer over cattail. Again, in this particular part of the summer, this is just in July, so this doesn't necessarily mean for the whole growing season, but at this point in July, sort of mid-growing season, this is what they are preferring to eat. So now here is from the cattail only trial. Again, they're presented with just the 2 species of cattail, so this was a little surprising for us, but the muskrats actually spent more time feeding on the hybrid cattail than the native cattail. In terms of total wet weight and even total dry weight, that was the same. More was consumed of the hybrid than the native cattail. Once we corrected it for the amount of time they spent, though, actually their intake rates were higher with the native cattail, so they were a little bit more efficient in foraging on the native cattail than the hybrid cattail. Okay, you'll note that these results have been submitted to the Journal of Unsubmitted Manuscripts. I'm sure all of you out there have a few of those on your desk and waiting in the queue. So but one of the things that I've been interested in is, all these feeding rates related to forage diversity. So what some of these results suggest is that when muskrats are presented with a more diverse diet, like you would find again in a healthy wetland, muskrats they spent more time feeding. They had total wet weight, total dry weight was higher. In the hybrid cattail that's in the yellow, it was pretty much the same, whether the amount of the dry matter intake rates for the hybrid cattail, whether it was in the 6 species mix or the type only trials. The native cattail, however, again, was much higher, so in the typha only trial. But some conclusions here from the feeding trials. 90% of muskrat body mass is sharp teeth. These, you would think for a 1 kilogram rodent that they would be so easy to handle, but they are psychotic and they will try to tear your hands off. So anybody out there that's looking to repeat this experiment, I know most of you probably are thinking in your mind how you're going to do this. Just beware of those teeth because they are psychopaths. Muskrats like to feed on other native plants more than either cattail species. I think I feel pretty comfortable saying this again, at least in the middle of the growing season. When forced to choose, muskrats more likely to feed on hybrid versus native cattail. Although again, there's some efficiencies there in terms of intake rates that we're still trying to tease out. And then this last one again, this forage diversity appears to influence muskrat feeding rates, and does, when you have a healthier wetland with more higher forage diversity, does that lead to increased muskrat body condition, which then will improve reproduction and survival and perhaps population growth, TBD. So the second phase of this was a translocation study. So we wanted to see what if we were to artificially supplement muskrat densities in selected wetlands. And the muskrat densities here in Voyagers are on the background level is quite low. So what we did is we trapped muskrats in areas outside of the park in Black Bay, which is just to the west of here, and then move them in equal numbers in each of these yellow dots. Those are our translocated sites. The graduate student working on this project, Ben Matikiewicz, was, as you can tell, he has quite a sense of humor. He's a big fan of Lord of the Rings, so half of his sites got named after things from Lord of the Rings. Or Monty Python. Those were his two influences, apparently. So what we would do, again, we identify spots where we thought muskrats were frequenting, so their huts typically are feeding piles, set some traps there, check them every morning, and we'd have muskrats. Then some of them would get transmitters put in them. About half of them got transmitters put in them. These are the internal transmitters. And then we would release them happy and healthy back into these new wetlands, and then track them daily for about 2 weeks, and then 3 times a week after that until the end of the growing season, essentially. So this is Ben Matikiewicz, again, the master's student from Kansas State who was working on this. These results are captured in this paper that came out last year in Wildlife Biology. But what we found is when we translocated muskrats, and nobody had tried this before, by the way, so this is a new thing, is muskrats settled into their new home range pretty quickly. So within 8 days, they kind of picked where they were going to set up their home range and set up their new territory. And that home range size was 2.5 hectares, which is similar to resident muskrats. So taking these muskrats from a new area and putting them from where they were residents and translocating them into our treatment wetlands, muskrats behaved mostly normally, it appears. They did move around a little bit, so most of them did not stay in the wetlands where we put them, unfortunately. So we dumped them into a spot, but because of this, all these wetlands are highly connected because these are lake environments. They would just swim around until they found a spot that for some reason they liked better than where we put them. But more importantly, we didn't notice any homing behavior, which sometimes has happened with certain translocating certain animals, that they will try to find their way back to their original home range or their natal areas. That was not the case here. post-translocation survival. Of the 68 that we translocated with transmitters, 23 of these we confirmed died. And a lot of times you can see on the right there, that's all we would find is a pile of hair and bones, and we don't know what predator ate them. But most of them were killed by where we knew it was predation, were mink, a few bald eagles, and then a lot of them again were just unknown. They could have died from disease or starvation and then been scavenged. But again, when you just find a pile of stuff like that, you can't really tell what the cause of death was other than they died. Weekly survival. So this is a probability of surviving from week 1 to week 2, for example, was 0.95, which is not great. So if you take that out over the course of the season, you know, the likelihood of a muskrat surviving the entire five month growing season is pretty low. And in this case, again, no muskrats survived to the following spring. Now, caveat, overwinter survival of muskrats here in this system is low anyway. So we don't necessarily think the translocated muskrats had lower survival. It's just in general, muskrats here have really poor overwinter survival. We did notice that survival improved if muskrats used beaver lodges. So here is a side view of a beaver lodge. And whether there were beavers using the lodge or whether it was abandoned, muskrats would use these, and beavers tolerate muskrats cohabitating with them. So, but their survival improved, and this essentially is, as you can imagine, a pretty nice, safe environment from predation with underwater entrance, and again, it's pretty good at keeping predators out. And of course, those of you that know me, once again, beavers are the answer. The question is irrelevant. Registered trademark. All right. So the other component of this, the translocation effect on muskrat population. So now we looked at the you know, sort of the individual effect on muskrats in terms of survival and movements, but we wanted to see, okay, if we dump all these muskrats into these treatment wetlands, is there any sort of longer term effect? And so over the course of 2 summers, we dumped 177 total muskrats into these 5 treatment wetlands. So that comes out to about 30 or almost 40 muskrats per wetland. And when we went back in 2020 and retrapped these wetlands, we only caught 28 muskrats total, and none of these were previously marked. So the answer to that question is this is it's almost like a put and take trout fishery. We would every year you'd have to dump in new muskrats, and again in our setting here. And we did look at our vegetation data from the plots, the veg plots that I talked about earlier, and we found no difference in cattail density between the treatment and controls in 2020. So what if I told you that muskrats don't appear to be the answer to treat cattail infestations in southern boreal ecosystems with low muskrat densities? Again, this further south, even here in Minnesota, I think this is definitely a possibility, but up here, this is just, I think it's kind of a non-starter. So I'm 41 minutes in. I guess I went a little faster than I thought, but that's okay. We got time for questions. Major funding provided by all of these folks out there, Environmental and Natural Resource Trust Fund, Clean Water, Land and Legacy Amendment is a huge funder of our work, including phase 3, the next part, which will start in 2023. National Park Service has funded a lot of this. And then also big grants from Initiative Foundation, National Park Foundation, and Voyageurs Conservancy. So thanks to all of them for continuing, for funding this work so far, and again, keeping us going for the next 5 years at least. And here's contact info for me and project manager Jerry Warmbold if you want to learn more about the project. It's our fancy new logo that we had made earlier this summer. Shout out to Haley Allers from Kansas State who made that. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. How'd I do?
Thanks, Steve. First question from Casey, is vegetative regrowth after chopping treatments insignificant, or are there more follow-up treatments?
Can you say that again?
Yeah, is vegetative regrowth after chopping treatments insignificant, or are there more follow-up treatments?
After chopping treatments? I'm not sure exactly what he means. They mean with the big machinery, the cookie cutter machine, for example. In that case, again, the amount of follow-up treatment should be pretty minimal. Once you get rid of that mat, again, you set things back, again, as I suggested, 20, 30, maybe more years. There is, again, because of this process, we take these big dense mats and you chop them up, it creates, again, a lot of material, a lot of which we scoop up and put on shore, but a lot of that material flocculent settles to the bottom, and it kind of creates this again is in the short term, this really loose flocculent that still provides some rooting area for cattails, but it also provides rooting area for sedges and rushes and some of these other plants too. So we have seen some cattail coming back in areas where we did, the chopping with the cookie cutter, but again, the densities are a fraction of what they were beforehand.
Another question, any prospects for using that harvested cattail biomass for energy?
Aha, yes. So, and they've, Dan Sidarski from University of Minnesota Crookston, he's now retired, had an LCCMR project a number of years ago where he was looking at this. And you go onto the prairie potholes, and they can actually go in and harvest these wetlands with basically a combine or a thresher. They could just drive right into these wetlands when they were drained or when the water was low. You could take that material again and use it potentially for biomass for energy. In our case, to basically the amount of energy it would take to go and retrieve all of that biomass that we dump on shore. So now instead of dumping it on shore, we'd have to dump it in a barge and barge it to a dock and then load it into a dump truck and then take it somewhere. Again, it just doesn't make any sense. So we've talked about it but from an economics perspective, it doesn't make any sense at all in our situation.
And although cattail monocultures are bad for biological diversity, do they still function in terms of controlling sediment or storm or floodwater?
Good questions. Ones we're just starting to poke around on. So as with anything, there's trade-offs, of course, right? So in this case, we get these monocultures of cattails that come in and again, degrade wetlands from a lot of functional perspectives in terms of biodiversity and all kinds of things. Again, providing space for recreation or creating all of these other hazards. But do they absorb carbon? Probably. Do they, again, are they good for flood control? In some ways, yes, I'm sure. And again, one of the other things, once we chop these mats up and get rid of them, again, we're releasing a lot of nutrients back into the system. So one of the things that we're looking at is what does that little pulse of nutrients mean for things like algal blooms and such. It's one of those problems where there's no easy answer, but in terms of the Park Service's mandate, we're trying to create functional ecosystems that would have looked like it was at the time of the voyageurs, and so that's the approach we're taking.
And did your muskrat research include any indigenous land managers to include their traditional ecological knowledge?
Good question. Not really. I know I'm trying to think if thinking back, I'm sure I've talked to a few folks, but I can't say how it really influenced the design of our study very much. So one of the interesting things that came out after we started this project, or almost simultaneously, is Grand Mound State Park, I think, which is just to the west of here on Rainy River. Some research that they did using LiDAR and some other things. I think this is maybe in the last 10 or 15 years. They figured out that the Grand Mound itself was in the shape of a muskrat, so which again has a lot of significance for Anishinaabe peoples here.
And what factors contribute to the muskrat's low overwinter survival? And how does that compare to other systems, whether aquatic or elsewhere in the area?
So Muskrats are a tiny rodent, and like all tiny rodents, everything wants to eat them. So, and muskrats, are selected species. They just have lots of babies, right? That's their strategy to try to make it essentially have their genes make it from one year to the next. Is to have, and some of them will have 2 litters further south. So again, they can have 12 or 13 kits every year, maybe more. And here they might only be able to pull off 1 litter. Not exactly sure. Some of them will be able to get 2 litters off. But again, everything wants to eat them. This is a fully functional, more complete ecosystem with a whole normal suite of predators. So lots of things out there wanting to eat muskrats. Again, the water level management is also not a friend to muskrats, because as they draw those water levels down over the winter, that can cause muskrats to freeze out their lodges and such. So the new water management regime that's in place now is more friendly to muskrats than it was 20 years ago, but it's still not as good as you would have in a system with a more natural hydrograph. For example, like you go into the boundary waters, these large lakes that are more naturally regulated theoretically should be better for muskrats there. So, and again, the further north you go, obviously these extreme temperatures, -30, -40, can be tough for a 1 kilogram rodent to thermoregulate. So.
And do beavers break up the mats in bays, and do they feed on cattails?
Again, beavers are at the center of the universe, as we all know. Beavers do eat cattails. We know that from some stable isotope work that we've done here, that beavers actually feed on a lot of emergent and submergent plants. Even in the winter, they're going under the ice and feeding on cattail tubers and such. Beavers do definitely channel into these cattail mats. See it in lots of places where they'll build their lodges on the margins of cattail mats, and even build their lodges out of cattails themselves. Was that the question? All of the question there?
Yeah, just do beavers break up the mats in bays?
Do they break up the mats? They definitely cut channels in them, and if that ends up just like when I talked about the channels that were cut for people to access their lake cabins, that created some weak spots where then the mats broke apart. It's possible that could happen based on beaver cutting as well.
And do you know the approximate cost of herbicide treatment in cattails?
I don't, because it's just, again, a non-starter. We've just never even looked at it here because it's again prohibited by the outstanding resource value waters statute, and also the National Park Service has also put a moratorium on glyphosate use in aquatic areas. So we've long since abandoned that that's any sort of feasible idea at a big scale here.
And are non-native Phragmites an issue or potential issue for your wetlands? And should we be concerned?
So we do have Phragmites in a few spots. Again, it's nowhere near as much as it is for cattails. And this has been brought up by some colleagues with the Fish and Wildlife Service over in Glacial Ridge, where they've had Phragmites come in and start to take over some of their areas where they've removed the cattail. We haven't seen that yet, but we have an eye on it. So, and we are removing the Phragmites that we have here as well.
Are you seeing any reed canary impacts up there? Some got into the cattail marsh on our property, and one growing season had completely outcompeted the cattails.
Yeah, similar story. So we haven't seen it yet, but we have an eye on it.
Another follow-up question that I have for going back to the beavers breaking up the mats, and maybe I mentioned this in the webinar earlier, but would smaller fragments of those mats kind of affect how you would approach them from a management perspective, or are they more or less of a hassle if they're breaking up instead of this one mass that moves around?
So they naturally, again, these mats break up and form smaller pieces, and they're actually harder to track that way. So, sometimes, again, we've seen pieces as small as, a meter across floating around. So in some ways, having them break up, again, they're smaller, more manageable chunks, but on the other hand, again, it becomes impossible to keep track of where they end up. And And so when it's in a bigger chunk, it's easier for us to sort of put it in the spot where we know we can then treat it later.
And another question, are these naturally low nutrient settings? Are there nutrient loadings such as phosphorus that accelerate cattail mat expansion on any of these sites?
All of the lakes here are naturally oligotrophic, except Cavatogma, which is on the mesotrophic spectrum, but it is nutrifying, and there's already issues with algal blooms in Lake Cavatogma. So Cavatogma in particular, we have concerns about, the amount of nutrients that are available. And I think, again, that's why we see some of our highest cattail densities is in Cavatogma and Black Bay, which is a part of Rainy Lake. That's also mesotrophic. So I think that answers that question.
Great, and I'm not seeing any more questions here. Next month is our final entry in the 2022 webinar series. At that time, we'll also have more information on the 2023 webinar series. And so we'll just keep on kicking out those monthly webinars. I pasted a link for our new website that's linked there, and the forestry webinar series. Just scroll all the way to the bottom for that December webinar. We do have the same link that we give out for all the webinars, so just click back and if you'd like to access that in December. Not seeing any further questions. Thank you so much, Steve, for your time and your entertaining Photoshop and canned laughter. And thank you to all our participants for coming. We appreciate it.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Cheers.